Are you in control of your life at all?
Oh, yeah, certain days.
Certain days.
Yeah.
What do you like the other days?
Quite out of control. I mean, amazingly drunk.
Drunk?
Yeah, mainly, yes.
Right.
On August 7th, 1978, Pete Townshend and Keith Moon, two of the four members of the groundbreaking British rock band The Who, appeared on Good Morning America to promote the upcoming release of the band's 8th studio album, Who Are You? After an opening package showed clips of the band from their early days in the 1960s, both men were in a reflective mood, opening up a bit about rumors of strife within the band and how they balanced life on the road with their domestic obligations at home. Townshend was married at the time, but Moon had divorced his wife Kim Kerrigan 3 years earlier and seemed to be trying to get his life in order. As the wild man of the group, the interviewer was keen to know if things had settled down at all now that the rocker was in his 30s, but it was clear from his answer that Moon was struggling. He'd clearly put on some weight and appeared a little sweaty and jittery, deflecting the tough questions with humorous asides, but never seeming quite comfortable during the interview. The questions were completely understandable in light of Moon's history. Even during an era of psychedelic experimentation and excess, Keith Moon's antics still stood out from your average rock star. Nicknamed Moon the Loon for good reason, he'd been interested in explosions and pranks as a kid, so after Townshend first smashed his guitar on stage after it accidentally broke during one of The Who's early shows, Moon turned the destructive episode into the band's signature, kicking over expensive drum kits at the end of energetic sets in increasingly novel ways that almost elevated into an art form. During one famous instance in 1967, the band appeared on an episode of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour when this happened.
Generation.
Moon had paid a stagehand to load gunpowder into one of his bass drums, which the drummer then set off at the conclusion of the band's signature hit, My Generation. Of course, the stagehand used way more gunpowder than necessary, so the explosion ended up singeing Townshend's hair, permanently damaging the hearing in one of his ears, and embedding a piece of shrapnel from the cymbal in Moon's arm. Such antics were wildly popular with fans, but caused constant arguments within the band. And they really were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to Moon's destructive behavior. He began taking amphetamines in the 1960s, and his pill habit quickly combined with pronounced alcohol abuse that only fed his erratic outbursts as the band toured around Europe. Moon would destroy hotel rooms, friends' homes, and even his own residences, often throwing furniture out of apartment windows and destroying toilets with his favorite trick of flushing cherry bombs down them. He even upgraded to dynamite at some point, which would shatter the fancy hotel toilets and send shards of porcelain flying around the room. He craved the shock value from these stunts, and the band was raking in more than enough money at the time to indulge the young rocker. But the lifestyle took a toll on Moon's health, and his hard-partying ways were already wearing down the rocker by the early 1970s when he was still in his mid-20s. During the band's Quadrophenia tour in 1973, Moon passed out on his drum kit during Won't Get Fooled Again at a concert in California after ingesting a bunch of tranquilizers and brandy. He was dragged off stage by some roadies, thrown in the shower, given a shot of cortisone, and rushed back on stage to finish the show, before passing out yet again during Magic Bus, and prompting an angry Pete Townshend to shout, "Can anyone play the drums?" to the crowd. Just 3 years later, in 1976, he passed out again at the Boston Garden, keeling over his drum kit after just 2 songs, and then absolutely destroying his hotel room, thrashing around so violently he actually cut himself and ended up in the hospital. The band's manager, Bill Kerbishley, was the guy who rushed him to the hospital, telling him, quote, "I'm going to get the doctor to get you nice and fit, so you're back within 2 days because I want to break your fucking jaw. You have fucked this band around so many times, and I'm not having it." The band took a 2-year sabbatical shortly thereafter, returning in 1978 to work on a new album. But while the other members seemed to benefit from the time off, Moon returned in even worse shape than before, having gained a considerable amount of weight and still had difficulty completing live shows. Nevertheless, the band completed recording Who Are You in April 1978 and was preparing to tour when Townshend and lead singer Roger Daltrey gave Moon an ultimatum: get clean or get out of the band. But it was too late. Less than 6 months later, Moon was found dead in his London flat. He was just 32 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Keith Moon.
Tensions were at a fever pitch within the band following their return from the 2-year sabbatical in 1978. The expectation was that Moon would straighten himself out and get his partying under control for the good of the band. Following the Boston Garden episode in 1976, things had gotten so bad that Moon became delirious and was treated at Hollywood Memorial Hospital in Florida for 8 full days during one of the final legs of the band's tour. The ultimatum from band members in hitting what would easily seem like rock bottom for most people, passing out on stage multiple times and getting hospitalized for a week on tour, but Moon found it nearly impossible to dry out. According to his doctors, Moon's chemical intake was the stuff of legends. For breakfast, he reported downing a bottle of champagne, a bottle of Courvoisier, and a handful of amphetamines to pep himself up afterwards. His girlfriend around that time, Swedish model Annette Walter Lax, described a man who was incredibly sweet when sober and earnestly hoping to kick all the craziness and settle down. Despite all the antics, or maybe partly because of them, people really loved being around Moon. He formed a close relationship with Beatles drummer Ringo Starr and Eagles guitarist Joe Walsh, but most of his pals knew how to turn it off after the party ended and settle back in a normal life. Keith just didn't have an off switch. Even a serious tragedy wasn't enough to scare Moon straight. In 1970, Neil Boland, Moon's driver and bodyguard, was accidentally killed outside the Red Lion pub in Hatfield, England, after bar patrons began to attack Moon. Moon began driving his Bentley to escape the fray and struck Boland, although he ultimately received an absolute discharge after a lengthy criminal investigation. Close friends say Moon was haunted by the accident, experiencing nightmares years after the event and lamenting that he should have been the one to die that night.
Yeah, this was a very big moment in Keith Moon's history, and most people would see this as a scared straight moment. You know, he hits someone who is a friend of his trying to protect him after a rowdy night of drinking. You know, he got in his Bentley, he didn't mean to strike him. It was chaotic. But instead of sort of scaring himself straight and getting on the straight and narrow, he goes further into the abyss.
It's the through line through so many of these podcasts, right? The effect of addiction. People, you can be scared as straight as you want to be. Being a drug addict is not a choice that people make.
Right.
It is something that overwhelms them. They cannot stop it. They need help to get sober. And he didn't get that kind of assistance, probably because he chose not to get it. I'm sure there were lots of people around him insisting that he go to rehab and get straight and everything else. But he tried to do it through sheer willpower. You heard from his girlfriend that he would rue the fact every morning that he had gotten so wasted the night before, but he just couldn't do anything about it. So the idea that he was going to, because he tragically struck and killed his bodyguard, that he was going to suddenly straighten out. That's just not the way the human brain works. It's not the way addiction works.
Yeah, particularly not for a guy in the middle of a rock star lifestyle who has those proclivities
it's constantly around him.
It's just the temptation.
And the drugs are just there all the time and everything else. Yeah, absolutely.
But in the wake of that event, he did finally resolve to get on track. He was trying. And in mid-1978, he rented an apartment in London from singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson. Incidentally, it was the very same apartment where Cass Elliot from the Mamas and the Papas had died 4 years earlier at the age of 32. And no, she didn't choke on a ham sandwich. More on that in a later episode. But apparently Nilsson was concerned about the place being cursed. But Pete Townsend told him, I don't think lightning will strike twice in the same place, and went forward with getting the apartment. To curb his drinking, Moon was prescribed a drug called heminevrin, which is a sedative designed to alleviate alcohol withdrawal symptoms. It's similar to prescribing methadone to people trying to kick a heroin habit. The idea is that the path to sobriety is smoother if you can lessen these withdrawal symptoms that typically drive people back to the drug. But like methadone, it's very dangerous because the heminevrin induces tolerance, and without strict medical supervision, it can lead to death if mixed with alcohol. So basically, if you're on methadone or on heminevrin, and then it's not enough to give you your fix, you go to alcohol, now you've got too much in your system, and people often die from this. The drug had been prescribed by a doctor named Jeffrey Diamond, who prescribed a bottle of 100 pills with instructions to take 1 pill whenever Moon felt a craving for alcohol, but no more than 3 pills in a single day. And this is just a recipe for disaster. Moon was not a man known for moderation, and his erratic mood swings combined with full bottles of pills was really just a ticking time bomb.
This is a philosophy to drug addiction that existed throughout the 1970s, which is find drugs that synthetically replicate the dangerous drug and ingested methadone came out of that. Methadone is still in wide use, but it had the tremendous dangers with all this stuff, as we're seeing with Keith Moon and
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, these things can help you wean off them, but combined with the personality types who often need them, it's often a recipe for disaster.
On September 6th, Moon and his girlfriend Annette went to see a screening of the Buddy Holly story about the rock and roll icon who died in a plane crash with Richie Valens and the Big Bopper. After the movie, they returned to the flat where Moon watched another movie and then asked Annette to cook some steak and eggs. Annette objected, prompting Moon to say, quote, "If you don't like it, you can fuck off." These were purportedly his last words. At some point, Moon downed a large handful of heminevrin. When Annette checked on him the next day, he was dead. The coroner determined there were 32 heminevrin pills in Moon's system. 6 were digested and more than sufficient to cause his death, while the other 26 were undigested in his stomach. Moon was cremated on September 13, 1978, and his ashes were scattered in the Gardens of Remembrance in London's Golders Green Crematorium. A plaque at the site reads simply, "Keith Moon, Who drummer, 1946 to 1978. There is no substitute."
Let's go ahead and take a quick break. More on Keith Moon's legacy when we come back.
This episode of Last Days is brought to you by Air Doctor.
Jason, Americans take about 20,000 breaths a day and spend an average of 90% of their time indoors. And the indoor air that we breathe could be up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air, according to the EPA. Indoor air pollutants can cause respiratory symptoms like sneezing, congestion, scratchy throat, and even more serious health problems like lung and heart disease.
So what's the solution? Introducing Air Doctor, the air purifier that filters out 99.99% of dangerous contaminants so your lungs don't have to. This includes allergens, pollen, pet dander, dust mites, mold spores, and even bacteria and viruses.
Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't love it, just send it back for a refund minus shipping. Head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code LAST, and you'll receive up to $300 off air purifiers. Exclusive to podcast customers, you'll also receive a 3-year warranty on any unit, which is an additional $84 value.
Lock this special offer up by going to airdoctorpro.com. That's airdoctorpro.com and use promo code LAST.
And there really was no substitute for Keith Moon. He was the beating heart of one of the heaviest sounds in British rock and roll outside of maybe Led Zeppelin, which featured another legendary drummer, John Bonham, who would be dead less than 2 years later. The surviving band members of The Who didn't even know if the band could soldier on without Moon behind the kit. Immediately after his death, Roger Daltrey praised Moon as simply, quote, "the best rock and roll drummer there's ever been."
To like one of the best musicians England's thrown up in the last 2 decades. I mean, he was the most original musician for yonks.
Did you
He
always...
was so good. I mean, sure, he was crazy and he was everything everybody said about him, but he was also an incredible drummer. I mean, incredible. I mean, I'd like to do a single now with 8 drummers, and you still wouldn't get as much drums on the record, you know.
Yeah.
He was that good.
And it wasn't merely because of his skills. Keith Moon was part of the core identity of The Who. Music journalist Bruce Eder said, "The Who carried on and were far more competent and reliable musically, but that wasn't what sold rock records." He just defined their style of controlled chaos, and Daltrey was skeptical that anyone could fill his shoes.
It is the end of an era. We're going to try and go on. The one thing that everyone must understand, it will never ever be the same. That died. But, you know, the way I'm trying to look at it now is like a leg fell off the bed. We made that bed and we've got to lie on it. And we're going to try in every way we can. I mean, there's endless possibilities. The least we can do is to try, and we're going to try.
And in November 1978, Faces drummer Kenny Jones did join the band, but Roger Daltrey groused that Jones wasn't the right style for The Who. Jones ended up leaving the band in 1988, and Simon Phillips, a talented and versatile session musician known for countless bands like Toto, 10cc, and Judas Priest, stepped in for a few years before Ringo Starr's son, Zach Starkey, ended up taking over the role in 1996. And it's really, you know, The Who have never been the same since Keith Moon. They're an incredibly important rock band in music history, but all of when you think of The Who, you're thinking of The Who's period with Keith Moon.
Yeah.
The beat of his drum, the way he sort of chaotically would bang on the skins, that was the pulsing sound of that band. And although they've had competent people who can sort of play the songs that Keith Moon did, part of the stage show, the kicking over the instruments, that stuff that Keith Moon brought, which was destructive and entirely reflective of someone who was out of control, is really missing from the band since then.
The tragedy of his death it cannot be overstated. But at the same time, the Who's sort of run was probably coming to an end, right? 1980s, that type of rock music was gone. We got into the Twisted Sister version of rock and roll. And we saw so many of the big legendary rock bands of the time, Led Zeppelin chief among them, sort of not be able to, I don't mean survive in this life and death way, but survive as a band going forward after that. The music changed. I think Keith Moon with Who could have adapted. Their music was different. It was, I think, more sort of
they did rock operas
for that kind of thing.
Yeah,
it really could have been continued to be somebody.
He had that gear to him. I mean, Pete Townsend has gone on. He's had a solo career. He does sort of softer, adult, contemporary-ish kind of rock
music. The Who still does a lot of stuff together. Roger Daltrey's still very much out there.
Yeah, but the band, like Led Zeppelin when they lost John Bonham, they just never really captured the magic. And maybe it's sort of okay. You know, he dies at 32. He's still quite a young man when he dies, and their music was so youthful and exuberant. Yeah. They could have adapted, but it's hard to think of Keith Moon sort of settling into any sort of mature type of rock.
So where does this leave Keith Moon in the pantheon of the great drummers in rock and roll history? Derek and I argue about a lot of topics day in and day out. I don't think we've ever harped on a single topic more often than the legend of Keith Moon.
Yes.
You contend he is the greatest and perhaps the most famous rock and roll drummer of all time.
I do. I think when you combine skill with persona, I think there's nobody quite like Keith Moon.
Yeah, his style has really been described as tribal and impulsive, featuring his athletic feats of stomping bass drums and pounding on toms like a crazed inmate at an asylum. Just listen to his isolated drum track on one of his final songs, Who Are You? Stripped of all the other instruments and vocals, it's just impeccable and sets the beat for one of the great rock songs ever.
I wanted to play that clip because, you know, we're getting into like Get to the Hook territory, which is another podcast on our network where we're really analyzing music. But it's easy to think of him as just unbridled chaos, but he's actually a very, very skilled drummer. And so when you strip out all the other music, you can hear that what he was doing was very intentional, very controlled in its own way, but also extremely exciting. And I think that's what the legend of Keith Moon is all about.
The antics, you see a lot of that in somebody like Tommy Lee, right?
Yes.
With
the upside down, roller coaster, the whole thing.
The people that came before Ringo Starr, there were no antics there. He sat back there and he played music. The music was very different, but
he really kept the beat.
It really was Keith Moon who sort of brought these kind of antics to the stage. And I think the modern drummer they stand on the shoulders of Keith Moon in a lot of ways. Moon's biggest influences were jazz artists, including Gene Krupa, a famous drummer whose flamboyant style set him apart from the smooth and precise Buddy Rich at the time. Krupa and Rich would have these epic drum battles on television that you can see on YouTube, which I highly recommend if you want to get a sense of their contrasting styles. He also idolized the Beach Boys and Motown, and Roger Daltrey always believed Moon may have left The Who if given the opportunity to play for a California band.
But he was also incredibly skilled, as I was saying, instinctively adding drum fills in just the right places and having a preternatural ability to keep time and rhythm for the band. Pete Townsend is a notorious perfectionist. If you ever hear him in interviews, when it comes to his musical compositions, he's very fastidious. So it stands to reason that there was some method to Moon's madness that kept the band in perfect sync on their sometimes operatic and very complicated songs. Moon and Ginger Baker from Cream pioneered the use of the double bass drum setup. And over the years, Moon's kit became increasingly ornate. There would be timpanis and gongs. It just got larger and larger in size. And to manage all of those different instruments is truly a feat. And it became an incredible thing just to see at the concerts. And you can hear it on the rock opera classic Pinball Wizard. Moon may have been out of control outside of the studio, but he's fully control of the instrument inside of it.
He stands like a statue, becomes part of the machine. Feeling all the bumpers, always playing clean. Plays by intuition, the digit counters fall. That deaf, dumb, and blind kid sure plays a mean pinball.
Rock historian Nick Talavetsky described him simply as, quote, the greatest drummer in rock, and said Moon was to the drums what Jimi Hendrix was to the guitar, which is, there's no higher praise you can say than that. He was ranked number 1 on the New Book of Rock list, 50 greatest rock and roll drummers of all time, and number 2 on Rolling Stone's list of the best drummers of all time, behind only John Bonham from Led Zeppelin. Even the very best drummers on the planet, including Rush's Neil Peart, cite Moon as an influence on their style, and it's believed Animal from the Muppets is based on Moon as well. Judging by the hair, eyebrows, personality, and drumming style, I'd say it's a pretty good bet.
So, Derek, we talked about this a little bit. We like to engage in the hypotheticals, the counterfactual. What would have happened had Keith Moon not died on that day? Obviously, it's easy to say that Who could have continued making great music with him on drums. It's difficult to imagine Keith Moon ever settling into middle age and becoming just another boomer on the oldies tour circuit. I mean, we talked about this in the context of so many other people who have died of drug use. Amy Winehouse,
Sure.
Somebody that if you imagine a hypothetical, a counterfactual where she's not an addict, you can imagine a career that spans decades, but he always would have been saddled with the addiction. The hypothetical, the counterfactual has got to come with, let's assume away the addiction. What would he have become? Ringo Starr of the Beatles and Charlie Watts of the Rolling Stones were able to gracefully transition to their later years, but Moon was not cut from this cloth, as we've discussed. His talent was so bound up with that endless energy and penchant for destructive outbursts. It doesn't really lend itself to concerts in your in your 60s and your 70s, right? You've got to be, this is a young man's game the way he was playing it.
Yeah, Pete Townsend no longer smashes his guitar in quite the same way. It's a little like you said with Amy Winehouse. She was this irrepressible talent whose legacy is linked to her worst tendencies. Think about Amy Winehouse. Her biggest song in everyone's mind is about her refusing to go to rehab. So it's so bound up with her legacy. And you think of Keith Moon, he's proudly drumming along to lyrics like, quote, "Hope I die before I get old." That's a main part of a legendary Who song.
And you've sort of made the point in the past, had he continued on a world where Keith Moon's a drummer without the antics, it's sort of boring.
Yeah, it's boring. It's hard to say like the light should burn bright and go out quickly, but with Keith Moon, it's just hard to wrap your mind around a mature, older version.
The counterfactual just almost doesn't work with him, right?
It's elusive, right?
Right.
And Keith Moon's legacy in rock and roll is very uncomplicated musically. He's quite simply considered one of the most important drummers in rock history, even though Jason and I can quibble over where he belongs on that Mount Rushmore. But outside of his musical talent, Moon was an endlessly frustrating figure, bursting with energy that could be harnessed into some of the most entertaining performances ever played on stage or in a studio, but wrestling with personal demons and self-destructive tendencies that would ultimately become his undoing. And so I thought it only fitting to leave the final word with friend and bandmate Roger Daltrey, who spoke with Howard Stern a few years ago about this tension that existed for people in Moon's orbit.
It was maddening a lot of the time.
Right.
And a lot of the stuff that he did that people laugh about, they think, oh, that was really funny.
Yeah.
When you were there at the time, some of it wasn't funny at all.
Right, because when you're in a session and you're trying to get something done.
But he was such a wonderful, he was such an enormous character.
Yeah.
Every facet of his personality was way out there. He was the most loving. He could be the most hurtful, most spiteful, most caring. It's all completely
like
fireworks.
Like